Okay. So thank you so much. You're welcome, Chinaza. You're welcome, Ahmed, to the reinvention workshop. So the reinvention workshop, it's a personal development program hosted by Evolve Project. Evolve Project is a department of Next Earth, the company, and our focus is largely on helping people to create a sense of meaning and a sense of identity for themselves, to having transform people's mindsets and to help them achieve the goals that they want in their lives. The work of Next Earth as a company is on two things. The first is on personal development, which is the part that's the reinvention, the Evolve project is working on. The reason why you're here today, and the second is on human advancement, which is the part that borrows philosophies from transhumanist perspective in order to advance human species using emerging technologies and transformative technologies. But today we're talking about personal development, and this is a workshop that we hold every week. It's called the Reinvention Workshop, and the focus is on helping people to understand the role and the importance of having a community and a system that can help them to reinvent themselves, to recreate themselves, so that much like you have a vehicle that you would time and again go to the mechanic or to the mechanic workshop and try to retool it so that it can become even more even much better, so for you to use in your daily activities and all of that. So that is in that sense what the reinvention workshop is all about, helping people to reconnect with themselves, to reconnect with their sense of self, being able to define their purpose, being able to identify and define their purpose, create a vision for themselves, articulate their lives, and be able to advance their well-being in the world. So that's in essence what the reinvention workshop it's all about. And we've had other sessions in the past. We've had other sessions in the past. If you go to our website, nextev.org, you would see the other sessions we've had in the past on self-optimization, on decision making, on many other topics that are catered to personal development, but more importantly, on a very deep level, topics that cater to helping people make better decisions for themselves and to find themselves. So today, the topic that we're going to be addressing, that we're going to be dealing with today, is the physics of judgment. And it's a very interesting topic for me. It is something that I have been working on for quite some time, and then the principles from this subject has really also helped my life, in a very huge way. So before we get started, I would like to get some of your opinion on what you think about the subject line, because I've got a lot of people have looked at the topic and they're like, physics of judgment, what does that actually mean? So what do you actually think when we talk about physics of judgment? What actually comes to your mind? So I'm gonna start with you, Ahmed.
Um, well, I think it's like perhaps about the mechanism, a sort of formula, perhaps, of how to make a judgment or a decision, perhaps.
Okay. All right. Interesting, Dr. Eileen. So we're here.
Because I'm your student, so I kind of already know that. It's something that I didn't realize before, but it's something that now I know well, I should say that I did receive some therapy before, so I know that every action is a choice. However, from you, I learned that there's actually ecosystems of, how do I say that, factors involved in this particular choice that we make. So instead of being a passive participant, it becomes something that we can leverage as power. Yes.
All right. Interesting. Yeah. So first of all, I think when we talk about judgment, it's a very important thing, and it's a very important topic. And uh, usually, when I talk to people about learning how to make judgments in their lives, I talk about it from a much broader perspective. And the question becomes, why do we talk about judgment? Well, we talk about judgment because you have to pay attention to everything about judgment because you are a leader, and the decisions that you make, they actually matter. And if you don't understand the consequences of the smallest judgments that you make every day, you cannot understand how they become the big ones that change the world around you. And the choices and the decisions you make every day are the most important ones in your life. Sometimes when we make little choices every day, what to eat, what to wear, when to go to bed, which movie to watch, what book to read, what magazine to read, what social media to read, turn on our social media and scroll through Facebook or Twitter or not. Those little choices. We fail to understand that those choices, to a large extent, are the most important choices of our lives. More important even when you talk about who to marry. And the reason for that is it is the culmination of those small choices, those small judgments that we make that build up to huge decisions and huge choices in the form of where to work, what kind of job to take on, whether to start a business, who to marry, those major decisions in our life. Those are those small choices. They are the ones that actually define those ones. So, as I like to tell people, when you're young, your life looks like your parents' decisions. But when you're old, it looks like the decisions that you yourself have made. So when you're young, your life looks like the decisions of your parents because the consequence of the decisions that your parents have made for you that will come to shape your life. But when you get old, it now looks like the decisions that you've actually made for yourself. So one thing we have to pay really good attention is in how our choices and how our decisions actually take shape, how they come into being, and what are the factors and the things that actually shape our decisions, and how can we influence them. So this course really helps us to unpack everything, you know, about the physics of judgment. So it begins with a very important question. So when we talk about judgment, what is actually judgment? Because I believe in defining things, because anything that you can define, you can modify, and anything that you cannot define overwhelms you. Definition is the greatest power that you can utilize as a human being because it gives you the ability to tweak reality to bend in your favor. So if you learn the art of definition, whatever thing, whatever it is that you're defining, I don't care. If you can learn how to define things, then you can learn how to manipulate the forces that are behind those things. And that is the greatest power that the top 1% in the world actually have. So when we talk about judgment, what do we actually mean? So essentially, judgment is about the exercise of free will to come to a conclusion, our ability to exercise our free will. When I talk about free will is not some kind of esoteric thing that exists in the cloud or exists in the maybe some kind of us. In the past, it was attributed as a quality of the soul. But recent research has come to identify the place of the free will in the brain, and that is the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that has over 16 billion neurons concentrated in the cerebral, this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, over 16 billion neurons concentrated there. And we have come to know that humans are the species that have the largest amount of neurons concentrated in their prefrontal cortex, more than any other animal. And it's in that package of the prefrontal cortex, the ability that actually emerged from it is consciousness, and with it comes ability to choose. It gives us the ability to go off our biological instincts, our biological script. So unlike the other animals that are driven by their instincts, they cannot go off the script that their biological instincts have written for them. We humans actually can. And the reason we can do that is because we have the ability to reason, the executive functions of our mind, which is a function that is enabled by the prefrontal cortex. So, and that is where the seat of the free will lie. Like if you're looking for the physical point, it is actually where it lies. Obviously, there are other neural connections and neural activities that happen in our brain that connect other parts of the brain, our bodies, and the hormones in our system to enable us to really exercise our free will. And we're going to look at how all of these things come together in helping you to make choices and to make decisions for yourself. So
okay,
that's what
can you
judgment
make me
is
the
all about.
co-host, please? Would you mind to make me a co-host? There are people waiting to come in. Thank you.
Oh, okay, so I think, okay, let me.
Sorry to interrupt.
There.
Thank you.
Okay, all right. All right. So I think you're the co-host now, right?
Thank you.
Thank you for reminding me. Yeah. So essentially, that's what judgment is all about. It's about, and it's also about controlling variables, ability to control variables, because when we are making judgments, we are playing with a lot of variables. And some of these variables, some of them are within our scope of control. Some of them are outside our scope of control. You know, when you walk into a supermarket and you go through the grocery, you go through the list of things that are presented in the supermarket, you would have to choose. You'd have to decide to buy the goods that you want from the menu of what is already presented for you. So there are a lot of variables that also determine what is listed in the groceries, what is presented in the menu. Some of those things are influenced by the policies of the countries that determine the kind of goods and service goods that are imported into the country. So there are a host and chain of patterns of events and things that come together to create the ecosystem of choice and decisions, of the ecosystems of variables that come to determine what you're going to choose or what you're going to decide upon. So that is a little bit in a nutshell what judgment is about. It's about understanding how to control these variables and how to use your free will to exercise this. So why did I call this this topic? Why did I name it the physics of judgment? So when we talk about physics of judgment, why physics of judgment? So when you talk about the physics of something, you are trying to understand the nature of that thing based on its fundamental constituents. That's what physics is all about. When we talk about physics of the world, physics of nature, we're talking about the fundamental constituents that make up reality in and of itself. So when we're talking about judgment, we're trying to break down judgment. What are the fundamental constituents? What are the variables? What are the elements, the factors that come to place that influence our judgments, and that affects the decisions we make and the choices that we make. So before you make judgments, it's important for you to understand the nature of what is presented before you. Is it a choice or is it a decision? So what's the physics of the judgment? What are the variables are actually involved? Can you control those variables? What are the controlling variables of choice? What are the controlling variables of decision? So these are the things that are involved when we talk about judgment. And that is the reason for naming this session the physics of judgment. We're trying to understand the fundamental constituents that make up these things. So to make judgments, it's important for us to understand that you need resources to do that. For your mind to exercise its free will, you would need resources to do that, because the human mind actually works with resources. And the variables that we're talking about, some of them are resources and some of them will need resources to be processed. So what are the resources that are very important when we talk about making judgments? The first and the most important is time. If you are going to decide on, let's say, you're going to decide on, let me use a very practical example of what is happening, what's happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. When the virus first came out, when the virus appeared in the scene on the global, when we started hearing it on news, it caught the medical sector, the pharmaceutical sectors and the medical system and the doctors and most governments. It almost caught them unawares. Now, there are some arguments in some quarters that some of them already knew a priori, for some time. But from what we understand, majority of them were caught off guard. And so you find that that's actually impacted on the quality of decisions that majority of the world leaders and countries had to implement with respect to curtailing the virus and taking care of it. And the reason for that is most healthcare practitioners and public health practitioners complained that they didn't have enough time in order to be able to find out, to understand the virus, first of all, and to understand how it works and even how to react towards it. So when you talk about making decisions, when you talk about making choices, when you talk about making judgments, you need time. You need time to process, to understand what college that you're going to attend. When you're starting your business, you need time to process that information. You need time to process all of this. And so when we talk about when you talk about time, you're talking about the ability of the human mind to process information. Because of the way our minds are structured, we don't have the ability, the processing power, the processing mechanism or the power of the human mind is not that fast, like a supercomputer, to be able to process a lot of information in a very short period of time. So it needs enough time to be able to process huge amounts of data. And that is a critical thing when it comes to making judgments. So the most important resource in making judgments is time. The second is information. For you to make a quality information, for you to make a quality judgment, one that is well informed, you will need a lot of data. And even still, to make it even much better, to increase your processing speed, your ability to process information at a much faster rate, you will need that information in a more organized way. And that is what is called knowledge. So when the information is more organized, you need knowledge. And that is why people who are more experienced in a field or in a particular sector tend to make faster decisions than those who are inexperienced. If you're inexperienced, then you will need a lot of data and then time to process that information. But the more empowered you are with knowledge, so which means the information is already processed and organized in your mind, then you can process the information much faster. So these are some of the resources that are very important when it comes to making judgments. Another important thing, it's You need sufficient options in order or to choose. If you're going to make a decision, if you're going to make a decision, if you're going to choose, if you're going to make judgments, you will need a lot of options. You will need sufficient options to choose from. If the options are smaller, it constrains the decisions that you're going to make. But if they are much bigger, then it improves your chances of choosing much better. Then the final and the most and another important resource that is that you will need is the enabling environments and enabling environmental factors and even material resources, the conditions that are necessary for you to make the right judgments whenever you want to make it. So these are some of the important resources that you need in order for you to make quality judgments. So now, what are the things? So when we talk about these resources, we've talked about these resources. What are the things that actually hamper our judgment? And when we talk about hampering judgment, we are talking about the factors, things that actually hamper or that can reduce some of these resources or distort some of these resources that we've talked about, thereby influencing the way that we make judgments. So there are three most important things that actually affect the nature of our judgment. The first one is noise. When we talk about noise, we are talking about variability in decisions, in decision making, which arises from systems that are ordinarily are supposed to produce uniform outcome, but they now produce a different outcome. For example, let's say you had an exam. You went for exams. You know, three of your friends. You went for an exam, and in the course of the exam, you guys, after the whole exam, you guys studied the same material. You guys know pretty much the same, have pretty much the same opinion and answers and knowledge about the questions that were asked. And so when you went to the exam, after the exam, you guys analyzed your performance in the exams, and you find out that you guys performed relatively the same. But when the results for the exam came out, you now found out that you have failed. But the other three of your friends actually passed the exam. But you guys wrote the same thing. You guys actually submitted the same answers. So the question now becomes, what actually impacted the differential outcome that you had, you know, from the others? What actually explains the differential outcome? And this scenario that I just painted for you actually occurs not only in things like exams, it occurs in judgments, in law courts, where sentences, judges give different variables sentences on the same matter. It also actually happens in companies, where companies give, you know, different results on the same problem, different answers on the same problem. It actually also happens in your own personal life, when you act differently or make a judgment that is different on the same matter, giving different answers and different decisions and judgment on the same problem. So what is the problem that is behind it? It's called noise. And there are a lot of factors that actually contribute to it. Some of them are biases that can influence our judgment. Some of them are neurological processes. There are times of the day that would force you to make decisions that are different from what you would have made in the past. In some of the researches that were conducted, to find out that judges that we are granting parole to convicted inmates gave different results based at the time that they passed, get different judgment based at the time that they administered their judgment. For people that administered the judgment very early in the morning, they find out that the inmates, there was an incidence of higher parole granting, that higher parole, that the judges actually gave higher paroles in the morning than the time before brunch. So which means when the time is getting towards brunch, towards lunch, The judges were starting to feel weary and hungry. And at that time, the decision making mechanism had waned down. And because it had waned down, they tended to, their decisions became noisy and their judgment became noisy. So these are some of the factors that can introduce noise and affect decisions in people. So these things, it happens to not only judges, but it can also happen to individuals like you and I in different kind of decisions and choices that we make every day of our life. So that's the first thing that actually impacts the judgments. The first is noise. Now, the second is bias. And of course, we all know what bias is. We complain a lot about it. And when we talk about bias, bias is simply a subconscious error in thinking that leads to misinterpretation of information about the world around you. And things like this can result to a lot of problem. There are actually two kinds of bias. There's the conscious bias, an explicit bias, and then there is the unconscious bias. The conscious bias is the one that you're aware of. So the best way to define a conscious bias is the kind of bias that you are aware of. For example, is when you decide to become a vegan. So that's a bias about what to eat, but you have that under control. You can decide to change your opinion. And the good thing about a conscious bias is that because you have it under control, in the light of reason, if someone presents a fact that convinces you, you can drop that bias and replace it with a well-informed opinion. But the problem when we talk about bias, the one that becomes problematic is the second, which is unconscious bias or implicit bias. And here we are talking about the kind of mental framework where you start viewing the world from a mental framework and you're unconscious of it. From a wrong mental framework, you're viewing the world from a wrong mental framework and you're unconscious of it, which means you don't have it under control. And this is a kind of bias that majority of us suffer. So there is a lot of this cognitive bias. They have been detailed out, defined. There are a lot of them. There is the confirmation bias. There is there is the conjunction fallacy. There's endowment effect. There's the halo effect. There's a lot of these biases. I might not have the time to start going through all of these things, but essentially, when we talk about bias, the core thing that actually causes bias in us is because of the inefficiency of our brains, our minds in processing information. So it's often a result of the brain's attempt to simplify information processing. Trying to simplify information processing. We roughly receive around 11 million bits of information per second, according to some data out there. Roughly around 11 million bits of information per second. But what we can only process by our conscious mind, it's only about 40 bits of information per second. So in order for us to take care of that, in order for us to manage that, what our mind does, it uses either mental shortcuts to process information. For example, when you are asked, what do you think, a practical example would be when you are asked, who do you think will win the elections, the upcoming elections that are happening in Nigeria? Now, because you go on social media and you see the name of a particular candidate popping up always, the tendency is for you to say, I think this person will win it because this person is always on the news. So that's a bias that comes from the kind of information that is presented to you always. So that's the information that you're receiving always. So it's more like it presents an illusion for you and forces you to think in that direction. Another kind of bias could be you having some kind of a bias for members of your group. So which means you think you are safe only with them as against others. So that's in-group bias. So these are the kinds of bias that can actually inflicts or affects our judgment, our capacity of making proper judgment. And it comes from you using a specific the wrong mental framework to view reality. In my book, The Exercise in Clear Thinking, an exercise in clear thinking, the main thesis of that book, it's all about teaching you how to use the right framework for any problem or any decision or judgments that you want to make, using the right mental framework for every judgment that you want to make. And the truth is that different kinds of judgments that we make every day in our life requires us to use different kinds of mental framework. When we are talking about decisions about who to choose to become the leader of our country, that's a different kind of judgment from what to eat in the morning. That's a different kind of judgment from who to marry. That's a different kind of judgment from should people wear nose masks or not during COVID-19. So, but when we start viewing the world from a specific prism, and let's say I come out and say I am a Democrat, so it now becomes that whatever stance that Democrats have on any issue at all, then I'll have to view that stand. I'll have to interpret reality from the stand of a Democrat. What are the opinions of Democrats on this? That is how I used to interpret it. Then it can force you to become biased in your thinking, because there are some issues that the stands of your party, your religion, your political party, your group, your family might be wrong on that. So when we are talking about scientific issues that have to do with science, you would have to it will serve you to use the mental framework of science to analyze that. And when we're talking about issues that have to do with kingship, whether I should protect my brother or not, then it serves you to use the cultural framework or the in-group perspective to view that. But when we start mixing these things, when we don't understand which mental framework to use based on what conditions, then it becomes a problem in processing information. And that is where bias can actually affect our decision-making process. So before I yield my mic so that I can get your feedback from you, I'll just go about the final factor that actually impacts on judgment, and that is facticity. Some of those things there are facticities that have to do with human nature. As a human being, like we talked about, because of the way our brains function, it actually limits us in seeing the world as the way it is. And so in that sense, it could force us to become biased in our information processing. So we can use mental shortcuts in processing information. We can come under social pressure. And those social pressure coming from our family, our friends, can actually inhibit our decision. The environments that you find yourself can also act as a facticity. Your sex, your age, your background, your race, your ethnicity. These are some of the facticities, things that you did not determine for them to be there. When we talk about facticities, we are talking about things that are outside of your control. You didn't determine whether to be born as an African or as a white or as a male or as a female. It is not your choice to make. You just came into the world and you saw that. So some of those factors can actually constrain your decisions and constrain your judgment. So these are the three factors that actually influence judgment. So I want to know what you have learned so far, and how you've processed the information so far. How is the information resonating with you? And if you've got any questions so far, before we'll now talk about how to actually use some of these things I've talked about, because when we talk about some of these facticities and some of these things, we might see them only from their negative perspective, but actually we can use these things to our advantage. We can actually use these things to become empowering tools that will help us making better judgments in our lives. So I want to get your questions and your opinion from what we have said so far.
Ugo, I've never heard this term before, facticity. What's the difference between uncontrolled bias and facticity. Facticity.
Okay, so I think I didn't do justice because I was trying to manage time. I didn't do justice to that when I talked about facticity. So when we talk about facticity essentially means the constraints that come with the way things are. You know, from the way that I use it here, the constraints that come with the way things are, things that are not within your control. So a good example is, like I said, you are born from the race that you are born. You are born, you just opened your eyes and you saw that you are born from the Chinese descent. So it is not your fault that you didn't determine that. So those are some of the factors about that constrains what you can do. Every day you have the rising of the sun, and it's certain. It is not under your control. So you don't determine when the sun rises and when it sets. And if there is a decision that you will have to make or a judgment that you will have to make, it will have to be constrained by the forces of nature. So a good example are those forces of nature. For someone that is predisposed based on their family history or the medical family history, so let's say cancer, or predisposed to, let's say, asthma, to some extent, that's a facticity in the sense that these are the things, this is something that is built into your gene. You're already predisposed to it. So you did not determine that for yourself. Now, this is different from things that are under your control. For things that are under your control, things like your education, what's to wear today, where to go to, all of those, some of those things are under your control. But when it comes to your gender, your sex, it's not under your control. Those are constraints that are built in by the way the world has been organized, by the way nature has organized it. So, and that can impact on that can actually affect our judgment. It can become a constraint when you're making judgments, as we are going to see as we go forward.
Thank you. I think that just to, from my own understanding, is that the difference between unbiased control, bias, uncontrolled bias, and facticity is also is not under external control, because I think what I'm trying to say is, like, for example, genetic is not something that's under external control, no matter what other people do, and it is unchangeable. But a bias, uncontrolled bias, may be changeable depending on our experience. I think, for example, like if we have for certain race, if we have a particular experience and then it changes from the participants in that situation, then it may change. It can still change our uncontrolled bias. Still the accumulation of experience in time. I think that's how I kind of sort that out. But another question I have, since we're talking about bias, is especially since it's unconscious, how do we, when we are making decision, when we are, for example, let's just say that we pick up something in our experience to interact with someone, like, for example, EKK, Taurus, he's in the same group with me, and then we are experiencing something. Then I felt like some of the things that we're doing I have been making decision maybe toward people with some bias. So how do I fix that? Thank you.
Yeah, so pretty much what I'm going to say next will be also be addressing that, but just to quickly attend to that. On a more general level, there are a lot of biases. Because of time, I have not had time to reel out all the biases that have been mapped out in the psychological literature, because there are lots of them. And then there are specific strategies for attending to each of them. But from a more general perspective, summaringly, I have come to understand that for you to take care of bias is essentially when you look at the world through the wrong prism. You get the point? When you're processing a specific information using the wrong prism, using the wrong mental framework. So let's say we are talking about in a company. Let's say you're in a company and you have your organization and you're dealing with your colleagues. You're very forthright when it comes to dealing with your colleagues. You are very straightforward. You are very, as a leader, you want the best from your teammates. And so you're very practical when it comes to you're talking to them, and you're very strict. Now, that might be a strategy that actually works in your company in helping to get the workers to become effective. I'm just saying, for example. But when you come to your house, when you come to your home, and then you're dealing with your family members, you don't adopt the same strategy. You don't use the same strategy, the same way you're leading the members in your company, and then use the same mechanism to apply them in your family. So a good example, your child might do something wrong, but you wouldn't cut. Yes, to some extent, you have to apply some discipline in taking care of the wrongs of your child, but you wouldn't apply the same high-handedness when it comes to addressing the issues of your child as the same when you're addressing those of others in your company. Now, you can flip this argument to the other side to say that the way you deal with your family members, where you use love, where you show them love and you try to cut them some slack when to do something. But when you come to your company, you're very strict, and then you're treating them like machines and robots. You're like, but forgetting that they're humans. So which means you are biased because they are not members of your group. When you get to your home, when you get to your family, when you get to your friends, you treat them with some kind of empathy. But when you come to your workplace, you don't apply that. So which means there is a bias that is coming in there that's preventing you from doing that. So when we now talk about using the right prism, the right mental framework to view things, is whenever you want to make a decision, you want to ask yourself, what is the kind of decision that I'm making here? What are the variables that are involved? Remember, we talked about variables in judgment. That judgment is about knowing how to control variables. So when you want to deal with bias specifically, we are now looking at those different variables. So you ask yourself, what are the variables that are involved here? So one of the variables is that we are dealing with humans here. And if you're dealing with humans have pretty much the same hormonal structure, the same brain, the same or almost the same general needs, at least if we talk about it from Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So in the sense that the members of your group benefit from you being empathetic towards them, and then when you're empathetic towards them, they tend to align with your wishes and your goals. If you apply the same principle, if you use the same prism to apply to the colleagues at work, it will most definitely give you the same results. So that is, using that prism, knowing which prism to use to attain things. So if you are in your organization and then you're dealing with people in certain ways that you feel that is biased, so you want to ask yourself that question: what are the variables here? What are the variables involved? Am I using the right mental framework to analyze these things? Am I actually judging the situation using the right mental framework? And if I am not, what is the best mental framework to actually analyze this issue? So when you start asking yourself some of those questions, then you will start getting into the nitty-gritty of the matter to already understand the type of bias that you're actually suffering from or you're going through, and what specific strategy that you can actually use in solving that. So when these issues are best solved when you present them specifically. So we talk about a specific bias then we can then narrow down the bias. But on a more general level, this is what is involved when we talk about bias. It's about using the right mental framework to attend to issues so that we can know how to take care of them.
Thank you.
All right. Has any other person got questions before we continue? Okay, so in the absence of that, I'm gonna continue, and then we've talked about the factors that actually influence judgment on a more general level. That's these three basic factors: noise, bias, and facticities of life. They actually influence bias. So the next question now becomes, then how do we actually make judgments? What is judgment? What is involved in judgment, and how do we actually exercise judgment? Every judgment is either of two things. It's either a choice or a decision. And it's important that for you to understand this, because most times, if you don't understand the judgment before you to make, you might be treating a judgment that is actually a decision. You might be treating it as a choice without understanding that it's actually a decision that you're making. And if you don't understand the difference between the two of them, then you will be running into the problem of making the wrong judgments, because the characteristics of decision is different from the characteristics of choice. So when we talk about choice is when you freely exercise your free will under responsibility to make a judgment. It's simply the freedom to exercise your free will. And for choice to happen, first of all, it has to be something that you do freely. So which means you are exercising your free will freely without being constrained, at least without being sufficiently constrained. You have sufficient space for you to exercise your free will, so you can choose whatever you want. That's the first and the most important thing whenever we talk about choice. And you have to have access to resources to exercise your free will. Remember the resources that we talked about in the beginning, when we said that there are resources for you to make judgments. The first is time. We talk about information. We talk about knowledge. We talk about options for you to choose from. We also talk about the environment and the material resources for you to make that judgment. So you have to have enough of this for it to be a choice. So what a choice is when you have a wide latitude. What actually happens during a choice, when you're making a choice, is that you have a wide latitude of control. When you're making choice, you have more control over the variables that are involved and over the factors that are involved. That is what actually happens when you are making a choice. So, and choices are something that you have the control, and it's something that you make for yourself based on informed opinion. So you have these resources. You can actually access majority of these resources when you're making that choice. So that is the first thing that actually defines a choice. So, for example, what's an example of someone that can exercise choice in a very, 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 very huge way? So let's say the president of a country, or let's say Queen Elizabeth II. That's a typical example of someone that can exercise choice. I heard that Queen Elizabeth actually has access to travel to almost every country in the world, with a few exceptions of one or two countries. She can travel to any country of the world without visa, freely. And she has lands, properties. Actually, she is the largest landowner on earth, like in the world. She is the largest landowner, over millions of acres of land that belongs to her. As a matter of fact, I think theoretically speaking, on a ceremonious level, she actually owns England and what other country? I think Switzerland does, not Switzerland, but some other countries that are also in the Commonwealth. She actually owns those things. And if you come to England, she is the queen, you know, with all the things and the benefits that come with the queen. So that is a typical example of someone who has a very wide latitude of choice, someone that can has a wide latitude of control. So the person has time, has information, has resource. If she needs any information, she can call the best scientists in the world. They can come and inform her, tell her what to do. And she wants to access any resource, she can do that. That's a typical example of choice. So choice is when you have that wide latitude of control. And what gives you that wide latitude of control is that you can freely exercise your free will and that you have access to those resources that we talked about: time, information, knowledge, resources. Those are the things that actually define choice. Now, the second is decision. Now, how is decision different from choice? A decision is when a judgment is impacted by minimal resources that constrain your ability to use your free will. So decision implies, essentially, when we talk about decision, it actually implies that you have constraints on your free will. So a good example is when you walk into the supermarket. What you are making is a decision because you are constrained by the number of goods that you see in the supermarket. You have to choose. You have to decide from those few things that are in the supermarket. You cannot buy something that is not in the supermarket. A good example that I always like using, it's let's say in elections. A typical example is, I come from Nigeria, and in our elections, before the general elections, where we have to choose the president, where we have to decide on the president, the party delegates will have to choose candidates, and people who win within the party primaries become the flag bearer of the party. And so the people will now have to decide on the president based on the person that the party delegates have actually chosen. So that's a typical example of a difference between choice and decision. Whilst the party delegates have choice, because during the party primaries, a lot of people come out for the primaries. Sometimes they are 15, 20, 100, many numbers. And the party delegates have many options and they have time and they have to choose. That is choice. But the citizens, the general citizen during the election, once they have chosen, the people are no longer choosing. They're actually deciding based on other people's decision, on other people's choice. So a choice is usually an action taken based on other people's, a decision is usually an action taken based on other people's choice. Whereas a choice is one that you have access to the resources to actually do that. So whenever you want to make a decision, whenever you want to make a judgment, you want to recognize, ask yourself, what am I actually making? What are the factors involved in the kind of judgment that I want to make? Is it a choice or is it a decision? If you think it's a choice, do you actually have access to the resources that are involved for you to make the right choice, to make the judgment? So these are the things that you need to understand. And if it's a decision, what are the constraints that are built into, that are constraining me from actually exercise my choice? Once you understand this, then you can now go into the next thing that we will be talking about, that can empower you to start getting yourself out of it. Now, the truth is this. The truth is that majority of the judgment that we make in life, most of them are decisions, because there are a lot of constraints in our world. There's a constraint about your education. When you go into the school, you have to teach what you have been presented in the curriculum. There's constraints about what to buy, what food to eat. You have to buy what's in the market, whether it's healthy or not. There's constraints about who to choose to become your leader. There's constraints about pretty much everything. a lot of things in the world. Now, but how do successful people navigate their world? How do they actually come to make better judgments in their life? They do this by, first of all, when they have to study the physics of the judgment. What are the constraints that are impinging on them? What are the constraints that are affecting their life? Once they understand these constraints, then they can start taking the next step of making decisions that will start taking them away from that constraint to a place where they can now make choices. So at this point, I don't know if you've got any questions before I go into the final session, final part of this session, where I'll now be telling you how to actually leverage, how to actually move yourself from the constraints that are built into the everyday activities of your life, the things that surround you, so that you can start moving yourself away from the constraints that your job have provided you, your relationship have provided you, your family background have provided you, your financial condition has provided you, the constraints that have been built into this, and how you can start taking yourself out of these things to a place where you can now choose. If you want to get to that place, then you can start choosing. And this will start to unlock your financial freedom. This will unlock and give you freedom in your relationship. This will give you freedom in most areas of your life. So I want to get questions, a few questions from you guys before I continue. Just to know if you are following with what I have. If you've got any questions so far, please go ahead and ask.
I'm just looking at my notes here, and I want to say that the reason that, I put in the chat, I feel like we can turn every decision, passive decision, into an active choice. And so that's why I always have this feeling that everything I touch can turn into gold, but it's not accelerating as soon as I can. I think it has something to do with, having to accumulate and then shifting through the resources that we need to actualize, the reality that we choose to make, right? I want to know how, the speed, like how can we accelerate the speed? I guess I was assuming it takes some intelligence to now I remember you talk about the difference between what we need and what we want. And sometimes I think that in itself is already kind of a huge task to differentiate, when we choose the reality that we want, we need already that wisdom and intelligence to really pinpoint, the future that we need and not just what we want. I hope that makes sense, what I just said.
Yeah. So what you said makes a lot of sense. First of all, I would like to, is there any other question before I take? So I'd like to package all the whole questions at the same time before I go forward. Is there any other person that has any question? Okay. Yeah. So let me take care of that. I think so. The answer to that question goes into the things that I will be talking about next, and that is about decision spectrum, judgment spectrum, where we'll talk about choice spectrum, and then other things. So I know that some of these terms may appear a bit technical. So using judgment spectrum on all of that, I'm going to use a bit more some of these things, but I'm using these terms to try to help you to make sense, to capture these things in a scientific way. Because you talked about fast tracking the process. How do I actually make it so that you can move away from the place where your decisions are constrained to a place where you now have freedom to choose what you want? You get the point. So, and the reason is you have to start treating the question of making judgments as a scientific issue in the same way scientists approach a problem. So that is why I've carefully arranged this information in a way that I feel would help you to actually process that. So let's talk about judgment spectrum. And when we talk about judgment spectrum, we are talking about the latitude of control that the resources that you have allow you when it comes to exercising your free will. So let's say you want to start a company. You want to start your own company. What's your judgment spectrum when it comes to doing that? What is the latitude of control? What are the factors and the variables that you can control, and what are the things that you cannot control? So when we talk about judgment spectrum, we're talking about few things. We have on the judgment spectrum, we have choice spectrum, and then we have decision spectrum. Choice spectrum, this is all about the latitude of control that the choice that you have gives you. This is when the latitude of control is widened by the abundance of sufficient resources. So choice spectrum is all about understanding the laws that will now enable you to access the resources that you need in a very given situation so that you can have control over the things that are in that situation. The reason why you would see somebody start a company and within 6 months or 1 year, the person transforms the company from a startup to a unicorn. And another person runs the same company or a similar company and does it for 5 years without success, and eventually the company goes bankrupt, is exactly because of this thing I just talked about. So the knowledge that you have gives you access to a spectrum of resources. It actually determines the spectrum. When we talk about spectrum, we're talking about the latitude of control. It actually determines the resources that you can access and the ones that you can access. So when you talk about, Dr. Eileen, about the speed, how can you make those decisions quicker and faster? It all determines on the resources that you have access to. So that's the time. First of all, it's time. And when we talk about time, I'm not just talking about the 24 hours that all of us have. The time that you have, the access to time that you have as an individual, let's say as one person that is running a company, is different from the access to time that Google has, so from the access to time that Elon Musk has. So let me paint a practical example. If Elon Musk wants to go to China, if he wants to go to China, before he goes to China, he already has someone in China. Let's say he wants to start a gigafactory in China. He has his employees there who are already negotiating, finding out the best persons to talk to and the best persons to meet in order to close the deal. That saves Elon Musk's time. So that when he comes to China, he goes straight to the right person to talk to the person based on already established conversation. That saves him a lot of time. If he's traveling from the United States to China, he's not going to take a normal plane. He's going to take a private jet. That saves him time from queue and all of that. If when he gets to China, they're going to give him preferential attention because of access to majority of the things, because of who he is, and because of the size of his company. That's also time, saving him time. So that's to tell you that time is a huge resource that people can buy. So there are other resources that we talked about, what we talk about material resources, or we talk about knowledge that can actually give you access to time. That's another resource, the most important resource that you need. And in that sense, you can then actually build your company faster. Someone who has worked in Google for 5 years or 10 years and helped develop the whole apps on Google, the majority of their products on Google, if the person comes out and is starting their own company, the person has his choice spectrum is much wider than you that is starting off as a novice, because he has experience under his belt. He has access to network of people, individuals under his belt. So when he's starting off that company, he has access to money. Most of those things. So those are the things that actually speed up his process. So when you're struggling to speed up your decision-making process, the constraints, those are the things you're struggling with. So if you want to improve your judgment and if you want to improve your judgment so that you can improve your choice spectrum, the size of what you can choose from, the things that you can choose on, you want to start from improving those resources that we talked about in the beginning: time, information, knowledge, optionality, all of those things. You want to start from improving them. And the first place I believe that you can start from improving these things is from information, accessing information and using that information to build knowledge. Though that is the first point. From using the accessing information and using the information to build knowledge, then you can use it to access people, relationship. You can use it to make money and buy other people's time by employing more people and getting them to do what you wish. You can use it to access a lot of things. And the internet, the world we are today, the internet has given us access to the most abundant resource that human beings could need to building everything, and that is access to information. So if you want to improve the quality of your judgment, you want to start from empowering yourself with information and knowledge so that you can start accessing those resources. You can start empowering yourself with those resources in order to improve the quality of the decisions that you make so that you can start going forward from there and moving up higher on the level. So when we talk about choice spectrum, I want to narrow it down to 5 things. When we talk about choice spectrum, we are talking about, first of all, information. There's what is called information choice spectrum. An information choice spectrum talks about the amount of information that you have and your ability to process them so that you can use them. And like I said, the internet has given you access to billions and a huge amount of information that you can access. So if you can access those information and then start using them, you are beginning to improve your choice spectrum. The second is time spectrum. What amount of time that you have and how can you access it? And what does it allow you to do? Can you buy more time? Can you leverage other people's time in order to achieve more things in your life? You see, these are the ways to improve your choice spectrum. Another thing is material choice spectrum, like I talked about in the example I gave you about Elon Musk and some rich people. When they want to access, they already have the material resource to already access a lot of other things. What are the options you have? What are the number of options that are made available to you? So you want to analyze all of these things in order to understand the condition that you are and the variables that are involved so that you can start deciding in order to go from there. So once you have analyzed these things, another thing is also environments, the environments that you have. What are the conditions around you and what does it allow you to do? So you want to analyze that in order to go from there. So once you have analyzed these things, the information or choice spectrum that you have, the time, the material, the options, and the environment, once you have analyzed these things, then you can you are then empowered to start going forward in order to make judgments. So the question now becomes, how do you make judgments? First of all, it now empowers you to know what you now begin to understand the level of constraints that the system that you exist in has already placed on your judgment capability. Once you have analyzed these things, it now empowers you to now know the level of constraints it has improved on you. And then you start asking yourself and start knowing how to improve those constraints by understanding how the system that you exist in works. So if you're a real estate agent and you're new into real estate investing, and you want to improve the quality of decisions that you're making, the quality of, you're just new, you don't know the people in the industry, you don't know how to access the right people, you don't know how to get the right deals, you don't know how to buy and sell. You want to start from the list, like we mentioned here. The first one, information, access information. That will help you to access more time and then resources. So once you have done these things, it will now begin to, you have defined your decisions constraints. And once you have identified them, then you can then start building to understand, okay, these are the things that are actually constraining my decision. And this is the time for me to now start making decisions that will start taking me away from the position of these decision constraints to a position where I can now choose. So this is where you now start entering into what I call decision maximization. So we'll talk about decision maximization. What is it? Decision maximization is about making decisions that will lead you to choice. So when you find yourself in an environment where your decision is constrained. So a good example is during the slave trade. Let me not even go further. Let me not go even further into the during trade. There's a movie I watched about, it's actually a summary of a movie I watched about a guy, a black African American, during the time when discrimination, what's and black discrimination was at its peak in the United States. So this guy, he was in the environment, and during that time, Africans were not allowed to own properties. They were not allowed to own land, to own real estate. So that is the highest disenfranchisement or anything that you can do to a people. But this guy had the dream of owning his own real estate. So what he did was to, as a small child, what he did was to, he knew that those who were actually influential, first of all, he found out that the most influential people in America back then were the banks and the money lenders. So what he did at that time was to go closer to the bank and then put his box there and then try to shine the shoes of white Americans who would be coming to the bank, the white bankers who would come to bank every morning. And so the reason he did that was so that as he was shining their shoes, he would try as much as possible to waste time so that he would hear those bankers discuss financial jargons and talk about real estate. And as they were doing that, after hearing all of that, when they left, the young guy will write down all the things that he learned and will put it in his pocket, and he will come back the next day and he'll repeat it. He continued doing that to the point that he now understood that he had to enroll in school to study and acquire knowledge and learn how the real estate works so that he can become a better in real estate. So he did that and he entered into this situation. And so what he was doing throughout the series of that movie, when he wanted to buy properties, he found out that because blacks were not allowed to buy properties, he had to go and liaise. He had to go and collaborate with a white and use the name of the white to buy the properties and then get the whites to sign so that he would become an equity owner in the property. And from doing that, gradually the properties were now transferred to him. So what he was doing is what I call decision maximization. And what decision maximization was about is about when you are in a condition where your decisions are constrained. That condition, let's say factitities of life, let's say conditions of life places a lot of constraints on your decisions. You want to start making unique decisions that will gradually take you away from the point where you are to a point where you can now start making choices. So it's about maximizing your decision. So whenever you're making a decision, you're making the decisions that are only scalable decisions. And what I define as scalable decisions are decisions that can take you from your current condition to a better condition. And you cannot do that without what I call judgment yardsticks. So judgment yardsticks would be having a vision, having a goal. So like the story of the guy that I told you about, first of all, he had a vision, he had a goal that he wanted to become a real estate owner and he wanted to buy money houses so that he can liberate the real estate industry so that blacks can start owning properties. That was his vision. That was his goal. And so whenever he wanted to make a decision, he had to weigh that decision based on that yardstick. So his judgment yardstick empowered him to start maximizing his decision. So whenever he's making a decision, he's making decisions that can only scale him from the condition that he is in into a higher condition. So you want to start learning how to make what I call decision maximization so that you can use your decisions as a stepping stone to take you to the point where you can make better decisions. So there is also what I call choice maximization, and that is about making choices with the highest return on investment to produce the maximal benefits in the long term. So the same principle that is behind decision maximization is also behind choice maximization, so that as you gain more freedom and more freedom, you make choices that will take you, give you better resources, more time, and more resources so that you can keep going further and further. Essentially, what choice maximization helps you to do is to build what I call choice capital. So like example I gave you with the Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth has a lot of choice capital, so which means she has resources, all of those resources that we talked in the beginning. She has wealth, physical wealth. She has knowledge. She has time. She has people that can provide her the knowledge. She has people that can provide her those things. So, and this is choice capital that has been built up over the years. Throughout from dynasty to dynasty, the family have consistently built up those choice capital, and that is this is the same thing you see in many families, like the Ford family, like many royal families and many families that try to build dynasty. They have built up a wealth of choice capital over the years, making intelligent and informed decisions that will keep building up their choice capital, giving them access to resources, giving them access to time, giving them access to knowledge that will keep empowering them as they go further. So, and in conclusion, this is really what it is about when it comes to making judgments. Understanding the condition that you find yourself. Is it a decision that you're making or a choice that you're making, and knowing the resources that are available to you and the ones that are not available to you, so that you can then learn to now know, okay, how do I start maximizing my decisions? Using the decisions that I can make, the little decisions that I can make, how do I start maximizing them to take me to a much higher level? So with that, we come to the end of our session. And I want to really thank you, all of you, for coming on board today. So if any person got any questions, please do well to ask before we go with the concluding remarks and then end. Thank you so much. So I like to start from the beginning of the room. I think I would like to start from yeah, sorry about that. I left a bit. So yeah, so I would like to start from the so I'm gonna start with covenants. Covenants. So let's hear what you've learned so far and what you think about the session. Is covenant there? Okay, we can go to Marshall. Marshall Bobby. Hello, Marshall. Are you there? You can unmute yourself. Make sure you're muted.
I think he just, or he or she just left.
Yeah, I think maybe his network is struggling with his network. Yeah, but we can, let's, Covenant, you can unmute yourself. Covenant, can you hear us? It appears she's not in the room. Maybe she dropped off.
Yeah, well, she probably she's listening in, but not you know, maybe in the background. A lot of time that's what happened to her. But I did say that the class is gonna last about 1 hour, so I think we're good. We're kind of on time. But I think this is a good session. It's a bit the concept or the delivery is a little bit still a bit obscure. I think that it can be more concise and more practiced, I should say, because I feel like, you know, if we can carry out the session, I mean, can you stop the recording if you don't mind? I'm not sure if you know.
I can't stop it because you're the host.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right. Okay. Recordings.